Russ, you said you were an optimist, but Steve's back there getting a mimosa, so I don't know. John Nylon.
Thank you, Russ, and the rest of the panel. I appreciate that. You know, when you talked about those 4 planks of a platform moving
John,
forward,
could you move the green button closer to you? There you go.
Thank you. When you talk about the 4 planks of a platform moving forward to stabilize higher ed, you don't indicate that there might be an effort to try and find a new revenue source, something separate from the general fund, maybe voted in by the public, that sort of thing. Is that on the horizon, or is that just a no-go sort of issue?
Excellent. Notice how I did the delay so I could think about that? The old microphone trick. You know, we've looked at that question, and you face a couple of major hurdles. One is we've done some polling, and while people, the general population in California, support higher education, they aren't prepared to raise taxes specifically for higher education. Now, that was a point in time polling that we did, but we took a run at looking at that question. The other thing we're very cognizant of is there is no way there's going to be a tax put on the ballot or in front of the legislature without K-12 and Prop 98 saying, well, just to be sure, I get my 50%. And so then you start thinking about what size does that have to be in order to make a material difference. And then you think about, well, the legislature saying, well, if you've got a fund source, then we can take some of your base budget. So you get into a maintenance of effort kind of structure. So it is complicated. While I wouldn't say that's off the table, I know there are other parties out there, whether they're looking at split roll or other kinds of property tax changes to raise additional revenues, and we're not in play on those. That money is intended to go to other program areas. So it is hard sledding to get a separate revenue source and to have it dedicated to higher ed.
Adam?
Well, again, thank you, Russ, for your presentation. And again, you and I are part of a small group, so you feel my pain and I'm feeling yours. I would not have wanted to be where you were at in 2008. On a personal level, you know, 2 questions related. How much before that recession hit had your board and UC staff to prepare on all of those, that laundry list of items that you had to take to, you know, mitigate the impact of lost revenue? And second, somewhat related, you commented briefly about the next one. I actually pulled out for Tim, I showed Tim the handy dandy cards that Governor Brown handed out one year, and I mentioned it to you last night. I mean, we're way past where we're all anticipating this is going to hit pretty soon. But you mentioned that you don't think we can go to that bag of solutions, so to speak. What other solutions will there be, do you think, that are going to break that, you know, break the dam and really help us solve that problem? Because it's going to be a huge problem.
Well, let me tackle the first question. Was, in my opinion, UC was totally unprepared for a downturn. You know, we were still fighting last year's war. We were still looking at the prior budget where we didn't get funded for the number of students we had enrolled. We were wondering when the legislature and the governor would fund us for students that they hadn't paid for. Well, that wasn't even a question once we hit the free fall. And so we were unprepared. We actually put a commission together looking at the UC of the future and trying to examine what the options were to deal with this so people couldn't argue that we weren't examining every aspect. And we found some good ideas there. A number of the changes we did in administrative efficiencies, changes in enrollment patterns, graduation rates, really came out of that work. But we were unprepared. I would argue that The buffer you may have in the first year while you put in place the kinds of changes necessary to cope with it financially may be the governor's reserve. If the size of the downturn is manageable and that reserve can be used to help buffer the initial change while you put in reforms to accommodate that, I'm hoping that's the best case. And again, a $16 billion reserve is terrific. I think that's a great thing. It just, from the Department of Finance's estimates, not enough to weather the storm.
Totally. I mean, not to pay for the entire storm.
Exactly.
Just get us into the first set of slickers and boots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay, I see Romy has a question.
Yes, thank you. It seems clear from your talk that expecting cyclical development in the economy that we will face a downturn sooner or later. And it's also very clear that when it comes to an economic downturn in the state, that the state can cut at the discretionary funds, of which we are the largest chunk. And the discretionary fund, according to you, has now shrunk to 10%. I remember a number of, under Governor Schwarzenegger, it was 14%. So even smaller, the hit will be even harder to us when the economy turns down. On the other hand, in reverse, it means that the discretionary fund has to be tapped into when the economy is good. And we have a few more years. I think our time is running out. I'm saying this in light of our November meeting when we make the budget request of the trustees. We have to go all in. This is maybe the last year, maybe one of the last years that we can really get something out of the legislators. We need to go all in. We need to communicate to the legislators exactly what our needs are. Because if we don't get this money in the few years that are left in this economic boom, then you made it quite clear we'll be on the chopping board. So I encourage the Board of Trustees and everybody in this room and the public to understand that when we are asking for what we really need, that this is a time and place. This is a years of prosperity where we have to ask for it, because soon the good times will be over.
So let me just use the, whatever my title is, prerogative, and ask Russ and others. You know, it seems to me, in my experience in the University of California and also now in the CSU, that so much of our annual budget discussion that we both have formally leading into November and then passing it on to the executive in November for the January budget, and thinking of the figure that Steve had, the importance of that January number, is so much of that budget is, we use different words, but basically it's just covering inflationary costs, fixed costs, mandatory costs that come from unfunded mandates or from just the cost of personnel and supplies, energy, et cetera. Do you think there might be a appetite for taking our general fund appropriation and our tuition, two separate questions, and tagging them to a modest cost of annual inflation, so that the trustees' budget, in our case, and the regent's budget in the UC's case, just isn't going in for maintenance of effort, if you will, but rather for new programs such as the graduation initiative or building capacity at San Diego or at Chico or whatever the campus might be, Inland Empire, San Joaquin Valley. So your sense about, is that in the realm of the possible, because you've ruled out the John Nylon's question of additional taxes, et cetera, as not being likely and so forth? And if it is in the realm of the possible, what thoughts you might have on how to actually go from concept to execution?
I'll take first run at that. First, the January budget by the governor is critical. It's the one time a governor can say on his own, these are my values. This is where I want to put the resources because this is what I believe in, they're my priorities, and I'm willing to pick and choose among a lot of good ideas of where I want resources to go. So January is critical. You know, I do think it's possible. You know, for a governor coming in, if I were going to advise Gavin, who is a likely winner in, 20 days from now, that the one downfall he could have is to come into the state of California and have it be in worse shape than it was when you left. I think Gray Davis ran into that problem. Certainly Arnold did. And so for him to say, look, I'll work with you in resources that are predictable and modest. I want you to put some of that money away because I want you to buffer tuition. I expect you to have modest tuition increases. I know that's a little bit of leap of faith because most politicians are running on keeping tuition at bay. But I think if they thought it through, they'd be better off having small and predictable fee increases. I think it's possible. You've got a fresh start for a new governor. He's got to make his way. But it is a time when a governor can shape and protect his legacy very early. And so I think it's a time to present these kinds of ideas.
Great. Thomas?
Thank you. This is a question both for Russ as well as the panel. It's interesting how we have this debate about how we utilize in higher education our resources and steward them well versus how the state is either funding or unfunding, particular higher education. But who has been conspicuous by its silence has been the public, who has not come to our rescue at all in higher education, in my opinion, about that. So my question is, in light of the data that you cite, which is 1 million people wanting access to both UC and Cal State that are denied admissions, how do we help convince the public that what we do in higher education, particularly in the CSU, matters to them, so that we then get more advocacy out of the public in that space? And then the secondary piece of that is, given the changing demographics, is it time to change even the funding model in a way that allow us to accommodate, I think, what costs more to be able to educate the students that we now have?
Well, good luck, Russ.
Yeah. It's, I've always believed that the first thing you need to do when you're trying to create a movement, a populist movement, to make a change in how they look at supporting an area from a social standpoint, is to prove that it's doing a good job already, that it's tried everything that's possible. I think it's really important for higher education to demonstrate in its partnerships with community college, in its use of facilities, and whether people are, enrolled, co-enrolled, both at community college and CSU, some different strategies to really highlight and show that we are doing everything possible. We're using our facilities better in the summer. We're using them on weekends. We're doing things to show that we have taken all the easy steps within our purview, and now we need your support. So I think it's really incumbent. And that was one thing that when we were raising tuition at UC, we really put a lot of energy in demonstrating that we're creating efficiencies. We've actually achieved $1 billion in budget savings by administrative efficiencies in the last 8 years at UC. We've got to show more of that. I think CSU, quite candidly, does a very good job about its public relations side and demonstrating its value. UC gets caught in some noise. I think, unfortunately, the state audit that occurred recently that created a lot of controversy about UC hurt the credibility of UC. And so from the public standpoint, they want to trust the institutions before they invest in it. So that hopefully answered your first question. You have to remind me of the second one. A different model?
Second one had to do is does it demand a different funding model given the demographic changes that are happening in the state?
I don't know. Obviously that's been what's been used at both community colleges and K-12, where they track students of need, in particular low-income students, and try to provide funding that targets them to provide more support and success. We'd certainly like to see better outcomes for those students, and clearly they face challenges that other students may not face. It strikes me that that may be something within the institutions, CSU and UC, can start reshaping, and that may be a good idea, and one that they can demonstrate that they're getting better success from those students, because I think there are clear drop-offs that are unacceptable in terms of those students completing college.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks, Russ. Lily.
Okay. Thank you so much, Russ. I really enjoyed, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word. You said you're an optimist, but I don't know if the scenario you painted was particularly optimistic. But I think aside from us, the system in higher ed, heading for the hills when the next economic tsunami hits, which we'll have to do. And as you said, we have already done those easy steps that we took during the last economic downturn, and it's going to be a lot harder now to find the savings. What I want to get back to is what you spoke about in the beginning of your talk about our tax structure, the volatility, and you mentioned a few things that I've been very interested in. I wrote an op-ed about it and talked about it. There's not a lot that we can do as an institution anymore. It's really up to the state. It's up to the taxpayers, as Tom pointed out, because they really are the bosses in terms of what taxes they're willing to pay. I know that a lot of the work that, I don't know if you know, the Think Long Committee has done a lot of modeling, and you mentioned split roll and tax on services, because as you said, our economy has done a total flip in terms of the revenue that we get from, services and manufacturing and sales. So what I'm wondering is, from all the different jobs you've had and different administrations you've been in, I know there's no appetite for it, but actually I was very heartened. Gavin actually said, I think it was in the LA Times recently, that he's willing to look at split roll and a tax on services. Because other than those things, where else is there going to be revenue? And going back to the idea of it being regressive, which I know is an argument, I think sometimes we need to flip our perspective a bit. And when we talk about the kind of students that we serve, who are lower income, first generation, think about it in terms of, if we could, a sort of a pre-distribution of income, in the sense that those students are receiving more of the benefit of our institution. So I think there needs to be a little bit of mindset, a little way, if we can communicate to the public the benefits that they're receiving. And yes, you may have to pay something somewhere, but you will be getting more back. So any thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, these issues have been looked at for a number of years. Are there some good arguments for modifications? You can certainly make that. I think split roll is actually going to be a tough one. I think, you look at businesses that have served communities for long periods of time, that some of those would be impacted most, while some of the larger big box stores would probably get the benefit. And so I think people are going to have to think about that and say, is that what we want to do? I think that's going to be a hard one to sell. I think the tax on services, or a VAT, I think there is some merit to that. If I were approaching it, one of the things I would do is maybe reduce some of the broad tax, and to say this is not to increase taxes, but it's to create a more balanced tax structure based on users. If you look at the tax for transportation now, it's really a user tax. And you could argue whether it's hitting everything just right, but it's going at those who use the roads And it looks like that's going to be sustained, at least the latest polling I've seen on that. So are there some ways to shape things in a revenue neutral to kind of get more balance and predictability? I think there is. The question is whether you're going to get voters to immediately say, and we want to increase the revenues, because it is going to come more from middle income, lower income folks as a percentage. And your point is actually valid. You know, that people are paying forward for some of the benefits that they hope to get from the state, and certainly higher education and quality education. When you survey lower income folks, that's one of the things they care about most, is that their children have a chance, that the opportunity is there for them. And so that would have to be part of the argument.
Eduardo? And then Peter? Eduardo, you're going to have to get right on top of that green thing. Not yet. Just speak loud. Yeah.
Hello? Hey, there we go. All right. Okay. Following up on the funding model from the state, we've all used the language that describes spending on higher education as an investment, and we can actually quantify that and show that a more educated workforce generates more revenue in subsequent years than it costs to educate them. So couldn't we actually operationalize that and start treating higher education funding, at least incrementally, as a capital investment, and actually float bonds to educate more students and eventually reap that benefit?
Well,
Is that a statement or a question? Question, okay.
you know, from my standpoint, there hasn't been a pure higher education bond in some time. I don't know if anyone has the number. Steve, you have it. It's probably been more than 15 years. And I think there is an opportunity to look at that question, especially if the systems prove that they're being as efficient as they can be, and then start showing some of the facilities that are obsolete now, that are no longer capable of the kind of technology and training necessary to be successful in today's academic world. So is a higher education bond a possibility? I think so. I think that's something we could look at, but I think it would have to be coupled with some commitments from higher education, such as with this, we can increase the number of California students we can enroll. We can demonstrate that we're going to use these facilities and maximize them in ways that are non-traditional, and show the public that you're squeezing everything you can out of those resources. So to me, it could be a possibility. I think it would have to be packaged with some commitments from the systems to demonstrate value beyond just here's some money for capital.
You know, Russ, it's interesting in our inventory of space, we can talk in how many million usable square footage we have, and those are just another big number that has no, we've translated in it's equivalent to 1,400 football fields. And then you can start sort of visualizing how much space this really is. And for us, 60% of our buildings are over 30 years old. And 23% are over 50 years old, and 8% are, these are just the academic buildings, not the non-academic buildings. And so our old house, UC's old house, needs some help. There is conversation occurring between our systems about this notion of a general obligation bond for the facility side of the equation. I sort of heard Eduardo's question on the bond on the operating side, on the softer side of the equation, as to whether that is a novel enough idea or some combination of a bond that might deal with some operating and some structural issues, which is not, to my knowledge, ever been done. But we're facing this cliff of it's going to require something different. We keep talking about it and saying the same thing over and over again. We're not going to get anywhere. So, any thoughts about operating costs out of a bond?
Yeah, it's been kind of the let's not go there mantra, because once you start bonding for operating costs, standard annual, where does it end? And you're assuming you pay 50% more over time for that one-time influx, where does the next year's resource come from? And so it becomes really difficult to manage a bond resource for operating costs. And there are a couple of states, New York used to have a bond they would put out for what their annual deficit was. So they would just have their budget go through. They say, whoops, we're off by $2 billion, then sell a bond. I think they found that wasn't a very good model long term. And so people have generally been very apprehensive about using bonds for general operating purposes. If it was to fund a tuition reserve account for some stability and for some stability for funding for the system, maybe you would find a different argument. But I think just for core standard operating costs, I think it would be a hard sell.
So Steve, I think, commenting on this issue, and then Peter, you're up next.
Can you, is this on? I think it's on. There we go. I agree with Russ's thoughts on a bond for operating costs. I think there are just a lot of challenges for that. One of the things, of course, we have been talking to the board about, the presidents, and there's been a lot of conversation over the last 6 months between us and UC leadership is about a capital bond. There does seem, and I'm not sure we've done all the polling we need to do, but there does seem to be an awareness among a lot of members of the public that issues having to do with the quality of our facilities, the deferred maintenance, seismic issues, health and safety, that there's a need there. And my feeling is if it turns out that as we pursue this, it really does look like something that's a very viable measure to get approved by the voters, let's say a general obligation bond 2020. Even though that would be targeted towards capital and perhaps targeted towards just fixing buildings that are falling down and buildings that are unsafe and seismic issues and all that. I mean, right there you've got between UC and CSU at least $8 billion of need, probably equally between the two systems. If you were successful in that, what you could do, of course, is take a look at what campuses and the systems are paying right now out of operations to rescue these buildings on an emergency basis. I mean, I know every president in this room could tell you a horror story of how they've had to gut some part of their operating budget to go to the rescue when something has failed in order to keep that building open. So there is a connection between the two, and I think Russ is exactly right that going after an operating kind of bond has got lots of challenges. But if you were successful on the capital side, that could really help the operating side.
Steve, that's a really good point, and I think, the other way to think about any sort of a general obligation bond really does require a campaign to move the people at the voting booth to actually say, yeah, this matters to me and my family and my community. In some respects, doing $8 billion worth of capital projects, improvements, renovations, seismic, et cetera, is a jobs for jobs kind of a proposition. The $8 billion gets spent on trades and skilled workers and unskilled workers with hammers and solder in their hand. And so there's a lot of jobs there, $8 billion worth of jobs. And then creating the facilities for our students to then be able to enter into the knowledge-based economy of the future. And so maybe part of this pitching of this is a jobs for jobs concept rather than just a cost versus fixing up these old homes. Peter.
Okay, wow. I don't want to get too close to this one. Lauren, I appreciate your presentation about the number of A through G eligible freshmen who are in the pipeline. and I think I wrote down 9,000 prospective more freshmen who would be coming to CSU in about 7 or 8 years. I wonder if we are, when we think about revenue opportunities, limiting our paradigm and being too narrow with our point of view. Nationally, the traditional student market that we service, that 18 to 24-year-old, is now the minority of all students in post-secondary education. And when you think about this huge market out there of the returning vet, the 27-year-old single mom, the recently incarcerated individual wants to turn his life around, I wonder if there's a market opportunity for CSU to provide services for that segment, particularly as it just explodes in size. Again, we're seeing that nationally right now, and that might mean a bigger investment in online classes, might mean bigger investment in extension, but these are other alternative revenue sources outside of the general fund that, if we could capture, might actually help us with our long-term goal of revenue stability. So I'd like you to think about that, as well as maybe partnerships. You know, Arizona State has a great partnership with Starbucks, where a barista can get a BA degree online while continuing to work at Starbucks. Can we explore those kinds of opportunities, again, in an effort to find more students, maybe non-traditional students, but revenue-paying students who get great education, but also provide us an alternative revenue source?
Lauren?
My response to that is yes. I think that it would certainly be within our line of responsibility to make sure that we're looking not only at the traditional students that enter our doors 18 to 24, but looking at perhaps more of what we call the adult learners, not that the students 18 to 24 are not adults, but the adult learning population that not only is before us, but also in terms of those that may have begun their education either here or somewhere else in California and really have not had the benefit of completing that education. So online education obviously is one of those avenues that we have to look at more carefully and aggressively. I know that several board members have been really asking us to do even more, as well as some of our presidents, and we're definitely positioning ourselves to be able to do that, and to, as you've indicated, to perhaps partner with some of those campuses. The other part is looking at opportunities for more fast-track programs, you know, and understanding that this population is not the same kind of population where they would want to necessarily come and traditionally just be taught in a traditional environment, but looking at other ways and pathways that they can acquire their degrees, obviously not sacrificing quality or rigor in any way, but other ways that we can get those students before us. And so the answer to the question is yes. It's interesting because a lot of our focus, as you have pointed out, really has been on our forthcoming first-time, full-time freshmen, as well as our transfer students, but we cannot forget the other population of the adult learner population that's right before our eyes, not only here, but also those that are outside of California that have a strong interest in us.
And I guess the one thing just to, as a footnote with respect to the adult learners who would not be in California, we have to crack this SARA issue, because it is a set of handcuffs on us that is for the state of California, let alone for the CSU. I mean, Peter, I don't know if you have any thoughts there. I mean, there's been political resistance because they're worrying about it's going to have a disproportionate positive impact on some for-profit, low-quality institutions. It seems to me there ought to be a clever way to say SARA for the public's period, you know, and draw the...
I'd love to have an additional conversation about how to crack that SARA nut, particularly when, what, 2/3 of the states have already gotten there, and we are now hamstrung by our own state. It's crazy.
I think we're the only one of significance who does not
They're
have.
killing us, and it makes no sense. So we ought to, you know, think about that in terms of the 2019 legislative strategy for this institution, to really make that a #1 priority, because again, it has so many great opportunities for us long term in terms of our own stability and ability to deliver a great product.
Garrett, would you mind commenting a little bit on this? I know you've been close to the conversations that Kathleen has been leading with several of our presidents. We convened 6 or 7 presidents up in Sacramento this last year, and more of an educational mission about what the issues were, and I think a lot of eyes opened. But once the eyes open, then those who were against it, double down a little bit. And so it's still a little bit of a chess match. Garrett, I give you 15 seconds to think about what to say.
That's all I need. And hopefully I won't take much more than 15 seconds to respond. It is a very complicated political issue in Sacramento. Peter, it is part of our plan for our 2019 legislative strategy, and Kathleen and her team have been working on this at the staff level in Sacramento. I think the debate right now stems largely around student protection. If we were to enter into the SARA agreement, there are several, and I admittedly am not one who understands the full complexity of the program and the debate, but my understanding is that the concerns are that California currently has greater protections for students now outside of SARA, and if we were to join, we would be lessening those protections. And so we're working with staff now to identify ways to mitigate those concerns and find a path forward. Kathleen and her team up there have some additional meetings scheduled before the end of this year, and it is a plan to be in some form or a fashion. I can't say that it'll be a sponsored bill right now because there are some very still strong political headwinds against it. But it is a part of our legislative strategy next year, and one that we have not simply walked away from. But there are some still strong political headwinds we need to overcome.
Well, I'd like to ask some of the longer-term CSU folk that are in the room. So Deborah and Leroy and Karen as our I'd always have to stop and think of the word in today's where I can talk about your length of service. Veteran, our veteran, your thoughts on this conversation, perhaps. I did see Tomas has raised his hand, so maybe we'll go to Tomas. But I'd like those of you who've been in the CSU for quite a while to, is this a back to the future conversation? Have we had this over and over and not made any changes? One of the things that was said this morning in Lauren and Steve's presentation is we genuinely believe that we're at a point of inflection here. And the point of inflection is around the issue of authentic access, AKA quality. And this regionalization issue that we need to come back and study and not study, but understand and think about it from a policy perspective more. But if we don't crack this nut, then I think we're going to end up having a more divided society than a more homogeneous and everybody having the opportunity for a different level of achievement for themselves and their families and their communities. And my sense is, at my point in my career, is that this isn't like the conversation we had in the 80s and the 90s when woe is us, we never have enough money. We always can think of things beyond our resources. But what really scares me here is the issue of our burgeoning population. And if they do not have the ability to access one of these public systems to get a degree or credential that actually creates that opportunity in the increasingly knowledge-based economy, then California that we know it today, the fifth won't be the fifth. It'll become the sixth and the seventh and the eighth and the 10th. And that isn't in anybody's vested interest. So I sense a sense of urgency coupled with sort of a sense of what will it take to change the conversation with those who can actually influence our future beyond ourselves. Thomas, and then I wanted to see if those three have, and then Eduardo. Yeah. Tomas. I'm sorry, not Thomas.
My mother calls me Thomas when she's mad at me.
I'll remember that, Thomas.
First of all, I want to thank Russell for his leadership of the College Futures Foundation. When you talk about regionalization, the College Futures Foundation has been an extraordinary partner in the Inland Empire with K-12 and with UCR and CSUSB and the entire leadership in both K-12 and beyond. So thank you, Russell. It's a great question, Tim, and I always wonder, there's a reason, and I've said this before at our leadership meetings, there's a reason why California is the 5th largest economy in the world. I believe that one of the reasons, in part, is because at one point, the CSU and the UC was virtually free, right? I have alumni that sit on my philanthropic board, and they say to me, I went to UC Davis Law School for $95 a quarter. Law school, $95 a quarter. And so California at one time made a very significant investment in the UC and the CSU to create an educated populace. And so the question for me is, what's different today? What's different today? And I would suggest that we have to continue to make those investments, I think we all agree, in order to maintain that 5th level, if you look at the GDP, right? And so the question for me is, we got to figure out how to convince our governor and our legislative leaders that today's students deserve that same opportunity. It's critical for us. I don't know if I've answered the question, but it's frustrating. I don't know what's different today than 30 years ago.
Well, I think some of the answer was the proportion of the general fund that went to education back in the day before Prop 13 and Prop 98. And the point that Russ made, I think the 10% of the discretionary budget were 60% of the 10%. When I see it, that's we're 6%. And we have a relief valve. And so when it comes to balancing, that's what happens. So, Deborah, did you want to share a comment?
When I first came on this board, we were also the 5th largest economy. It was when I was first appointed by Gray Davis. It was golden times. There was a lot of money around, and then all of a sudden, if everyone remembers, all the lights went out in California. There was no, remember all the bargaining, and I'm going way back with the power. There wasn't anywhere, and the economy kind of crashed, and things changed. I think, Tomas, to me, I'm not a numbers person. It's a very simple thing. It's just, there's a lot of people now. There's a lot of people that want to go to the university. When I first came on this board, you could get into a lot of our campuses, Northridge, in August.
I got in.
Yeah, at the last minute. Tuition was $14,095, I think, at the time.
1,400.
1,400. Did I say 1,000?
Yes.
Yeah.
You did say you're not good with numbers.
I told you it was good times. But I think what I'm seeing now, it is not back to the future. I think it's great. We used to always say that we have the 3 A's here, accountability, adaptability, accessibility. I mean, not adaptability, I'm sorry, accessibility, access, and affordability. So I said we should add to that adaptability. And I think what we're doing now is the state is ever-changing, growing. There's more of a need to educate everyone. And I know there was a time when it was free. I can't remember what I paid for tuition when I went to the CSU, which had to be completely insignificant because there was no money in my family at all. So, but I think we have to be adaptable to the times. We have to take care of all the students that want to come in and the changing demographics and accountability. And I think it's really just that simple. There's just a lot more of us. That's my theory, one of them.
Thank you, Deborah. Leroy, and then Karen.
So I think part of it was a little bit back to the future in terms of some of the thoughts that were raised today. Yes, we were funded much more richly, and every time there were cuts, we always wanted to go back to the golden era, and there probably was no golden era. because there never was enough money. But it was funded very differently. We all paid a lot less. I paid $638.25 per year to go to Cal for my undergraduate degree. But the state was paying 95% of the budget, operating budget of the university, and not half. Your idea of maybe having a stable budget and then having that incremental, I think it used to be called PIP, right? Performance Improvement Programs that we all put in to try to get changes in terms of the budget, saying something new. But, you know, those days are past in a way. The Orange Book saved us in some ways. It was terrible in others, but it actually did provide a stable budget and provided that opportunity for exactly that idea of PIPs. I think the inflection point right now is that we have decimated our quality. I mean, we all want to be proud that we're still doing all the best we can, but the quality has diminished. Over the cuts over the years, back in the 80s, the 90s, the 2008-11 period, I mean, we've never gotten those dollars back in the same way. We've all made cuts. We've got more students to serve. We'd never be able to replace what we used to do. We only could do what we had with what we had, and then those incremental dollars provided us the opportunity to do a little bit more for students. But the other part you talked about, the unfunded mandates, all the different costs, we looked at the dollar side of revenue, but we didn't look at the expenditure side of the things that we had to pay for now that we never used to pay for before. And that's why I say the quality, I believe, has diminished, because we don't have all the dollars to do all the good things we were doing prior, because we have to do so many other things that are either legal mandates, legislative mandates, or that we just need to cover. So I think it is very different, and we have a very different population that existed back in the 60s and the 70s in terms of demographics of our students, the demographics of the state of California, and who has to be served.
Great, Leroy. Karen, are you going to share some thoughts? You can't do anything without a green light.
Leroy covered several of my points. I had both reactions, Tim, to your question. One, there are new elements, and we're also doing Back to the Future, having Back to the Future conversations. So in terms of what I think are the different elements, Leroy has suggested some of them. And certainly whether you take 1960s to 2000, what we know in the national economy, and certainly what we know in California, is now the argument is even stronger for the need for higher education to have any viable future jobs and compensation. So the demand is there. What we know, and Leroy was saying it, that the demographics are different, that the students coming to us are not white, lower middle class students. They are from still less than equal educational backgrounds in K through 12, so they need, Lauren mentioned it, more supportive services when they get to us to get through us. So I think there are really differences. And from somebody who is not from California, in other states, we actually looked at California and looked at how this model worked and sat back and thought how effective it was. But I would say to you, one of the things that we didn't discuss here, but now I'm going back to the future, where we have had these conversations, is I have found it absolutely hard to understand in 15 years the tuition model that we have, not increased tuition, but the fact that we remain one of the few institutions in the nation that does not charge tuition on a per credit hour basis. So as I have, and we all have embraced the graduation initiative, in fact, when we move students up in the unit load, as most of us have done at our institutions, it goes absolutely contrary to the business model, where 7 units is really what the model funds, because at 7 units, you've got that prime amount of dollars. Beyond that, we are stretching resources. So I also think the other piece that we haven't probably talked about recently is the structure of our tuition model. And as we move forward to both authentic access and degree completion, I don't know how the business model, even without a tuition increase, is going to allow us to not decrease the quality of instruction and support services for students. So I think we have a little bit of both.
On the tuition model, and if you go to fast food and you order small French fries, it's $1.50, and medium or $2.50, and larger $4. I have a 14-year-old, so I need to get a couple larges, but that's a different story. Whereas for us, if we charge for 12 credits and then somebody takes 15 or 18, they're not paying anymore, but there's a cost of delivery for those two. And of course, the counter argument is an academic one, and that is we want our students to take some exploratory courses, or if they stub their toe. But it would seem to me that this may be another fertile area to go through that doesn't penalize students, but actually helps create a financing model that's consistent with our delivery model. Eduardo, you had your hand up, and then Adela. And who? John? And John. Well, turn off the other ones. I think you may also be.
Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to make a comment and just take another stab at the capital model because we're trying to think out of the box and trying to think of something different after all these years. And I do think that there has been a sea change in the CSU since 1981 when I first joined it. And that is that we're now realize that we're not in the enrollment business, we're in the graduation business. And so we are not, we don't have, when we talk about our operating budget and our costs, it's not about funding enrollment activity, it is about producing graduates as an asset. And so if we're focusing on producing graduates, maybe what we might consider funding on with bonds is not the enrollment, but the graduates. So if we tied bond-based funding to a certain number of graduates, that would in fact make it very clear that there's a connection between that investment on that bond and the generation of a stream of revenue, of incremental new revenue to the state that's going to come out of the improved tax base that those students are going to generate. So I'm not giving up on this idea. I think I'll write it up in paper.
We need an Eduardo paper on this. I have Adela and John Nylon. Yeah, pass the lucky one over there. Yeah.
So you had mentioned about the master plan. And one of the things that I always remembered from my college days at Berkeley, the master plan was started in 1958. It was kind of a backdoor deal with a group of men who decided that they were going to cut the state in different ways. And I think it worked well in the context of that particular historical moment, that historical demographic idea. And I'm not suggesting the master plan should be thrown out, but I do think there's been enough research done. I know at University of Pennsylvania, there's a book by Finney that really is quite, looks at it as kind of not creating the kind of efficiencies across systems relative to other systems of higher education. And I also think that the information about the geographic, locations of individuals requires different synergies now. So I think, are there any groups right now really looking in the foundation world to talk about, okay, let's look at this in terms of this new reality. Let's see how it should be revised or how we should look at where there are possible synergies in systems. And is your foundation doing that as well?
Russ?
Yeah,
I think your point's well taken. I think there is some work being done in that area. The way we approach it is not to throw out the master plan or to get into, let's have a new, but how to make it work in today's world. And because we have many different factors, technology, mobility, where the young people are, that we need to think about how we approach it. The biggest gap, as I mentioned, that the master plan never talked about funding, never talked about budget or resources. And so we're kind of left with this global idea about how the system should work together. But I think it's important that we operationalize that. And so I think part of it is demonstrating, and I know Tim and other education editors are looking at how can we work together in more creative ways to reach students and to accelerate their graduation through the systems. And I think that is the next phase of work. And so that's what we've been working on.
Adela, you're right that the master plan did have an element of sort of a political truce, if you will, to get the three legs to create some lane lines. But Dorothy Donahoe was the architect and the author of the master plan from Bakersfield, so it wasn't all men. It was actually a very successful, in Lynette, actually, on the Bakersfield campus, there's a recognition of Dorothy's role, and she never got the credit for it. But it was a really very quite seminal piece of work. John?
That's a great segue to Bakersfield. In fact, Dorothy Donahoe Hall is in memory of her. She passed away before her legislation actually was passed, so it's a great legacy. But back to the 1960s model, you know, they didn't have a financing source because it was pre-ballot box budgeting by the state of California. It was pre-Prop 13, pre-Prop 98. And many things have restricted the way the budgets could operate that were not restricting them in 1960. They probably had no ability to anticipate that. But the point I was trying to make is that we never seemed to get on the ballot. Other organizations, other places got protection based on the citizens voting for how important those functions are. And that was really the origin of the very first question I asked you. Can we establish the kind of appetite where we can also be a benefactor of ballot box budgeting? And one quick question to Steve. You know, Lauren said we need 3 to 5% enrollment increase over the next 10 years. What's the bogey? I mean, what's the dollar amount that we're talking about that we will be coming to the legislature each and every year for 10 years so that we can meet that, that demand?
Sure. You know, your point's right. Ballot box budgeting really started, say, 30 years ago, and it has carved up state resources, putting us in that discretionary pot fighting for dollars that's very difficult terrain. Is there an appetite for one more chunk of dedicated resources and carve out for higher education? I think what the other people who've gotten ahead of us in the parade understand is that if higher education gets a carve out, that puts pressure on their side. And so you don't go in without enemies. And so you go in, even though you've got the moral high ground, and say, this is what we want to accomplish. We want to educate and graduate kids and have the right instincts and values. The other people who have carved out their share go, how is that going to influence me? When we hit a down year, what does higher education get and how does that influence me? So is it possible? Yes, but the more it's become constrained, the more difficult it is to get the next bite.
John? Oh.
Oh, John, you got a follow-up? Or Steve, I'm sorry. And then Gene.
To get to your question about what is that number, simply put, if you were to have the state invest $450 million per year, which I think is roughly where we kind of as a board ended up in the last meeting, the September meeting, and you did that consistently over the next number of years from now till the PPIC deadline for the $1 million degrees, that you could make it. You could fund the 5% enrollment growth. two variables in that would be if there was, as Russ was suggesting, an agreement with the state to do a modest, planned, reasonable set of tuition increases, you could lower that investment a bit. And also, if the state did, if we ended up with a successful general obligation bond or something like that, that take out the pressure off the campus operating budgets to deal with all of these fixes that they have to deal with to the physical infrastructure, that could reduce it a bit too. But the simple answer is roughly in that $450 million range.
You, Chair. I have Jean, Adam, and Ellen.
At this really valuable conversation, and I realize the problems have no solution. And that's why we're here. I've been wrestling with this whole identity issue of what is the CSU? What is the CSU story? How do we tell the CSU story? And I think most of us feel that we don't tell it well. People don't know what the CSU is. We know because it's part of our lives. We care about it. Somehow we have to tell our story to be able to make any change, to make anything to find the solution. And in thinking about what all of you have told us, and I think I can't thank you enough because I learned so much this morning. The one thing that we don't do in addition to telling our story well is we're not entrepreneurs. And this state is made up of entrepreneurs. And maybe we need to create much better liaisons and relationships across this state to help those who have changed our world so much, help us figure out how we can do our job better, or how we can continue to set a standard and not feel that we're not able to provide the quality education that we all want, because we need other solutions. So story and entrepreneurship are two other things to just keep in the discussion.
Very good, Jean. Thank you. Adam, Ellen, and Joe.
Does this one work? Okay, good. On that last comment, Gene, I could not agree with you more, especially your comment about entrepreneurial. I think it's incredibly important. This is not so much a question as it is an observation, but you can feel free to comment, especially Steve. Staff, you guys always do such a phenomenal job, and we've seen a lot of these charts and reports before, but sometimes you chop it up in a different way, and we see something that we maybe didn't see before. But when I look at page 4 of your slide presentation, the core expenses per FTES, we'll just say tuition is roughly $7,000. I know that's not the true cost per year for a student, but just pure tuition, roughly $7,000. That's far less than half of our actual cost, and our state general fund dollars are less than we're getting from tuition. I mean, we've got a structural problem on our hands. Now, I know it's not that simple, but when you look at it like this, it's pretty stark. It reminds me of the phrase, I've met the enemy and he is us. I think we've got to be cognizant of that, combining Gene's point about entrepreneurial, and there's always the revenue side of the balance sheet, but we've got to address our cost structure somehow. Not that this is going to be something that we get into the weeds on today, but I'm just amazed that it jumped out at me today for the first time. We've kind of known it inherently, but it's nice to see on paper. We now know what the problem is, and we can solve it.
Thank you, Adam. Ellen?
I have a question for you, Russ. Thank you for the great presentation. But what I'm wondering is, you mentioned that this would be an opportune time for the CSU to consider asking Gavin to help buffer and to perhaps plan for modest incremental tuition increases. But in the same breath, you also mentioned that collaboration with the UCs and the community colleges might also be important. So I'm wondering if you have any practical suggestions. I was at a recent event in Stockton, and President Napolitano was addressing a 100th anniversary of a women's organization there, and she was I was at her table and asked her if the UC was considering multi-year tuition, and she said yes, they are already implementing such a process. So do you have suggestions on how, when you said partner with the UC, do you also mean partner with the UC and the community colleges on a multi-year tuitional kind of thing? And how the heck would you proceed with that kind of a complicated scenario?
I do think that it's best if CSU and UC hold hands together and jump into the fray to solve this. I think they have to partner with community colleges, but they have a separate fund source. They have Proposition 98. They can kind of manage their own path. But so I look at the partnership with community colleges really being on how you navigate and assist young people moving through and graduating. Articulation agreements, transfer, all of those issues need to be transparent to the students and one that's easy for them to track. I think the issue of a multi-year compact, if you will, an agreement going forward and a reserve account is really for the four-year institutions. And that's one where I think a partnership with CSU and UC and getting their alumni, students, parents to all say, we need to protect this resource and hold hands and jump into that cold water together. And I think the strength of both institutions working together is the only way that's possible.
Very good. Joe?
Yes, I wanted to thank all three of you for your presentations today. And you clearly outlined the challenges that we face. I guess I want to think about it with you in terms of the opportunity and the fact that, you know, when I travel around the country and talk to many other presidents, they're desperate for students. They're developing these elaborate recruitment strategies just to make enrollment targets. And here we are, blessed with incredibly talented students from diverse backgrounds, you know, many first generation of college students, immigrant families who are voting with their feet. They want to come to the CSU and the UC and the community colleges, and we have this economy that's number 5. Why not tie our future to them, that we're educating the next generation of leaders? We have the opportunity to go from 5 to, let's just say 1. Let's be bold and go for the top. And we have the assets, the people that want to come and get an education. And so how do we frame that in a more positive way to the legislature, to the governor, to the people of California, that that's possible in our Golden State, that we can go to the very top because we have an incredibly talented population of hardworking, passionate, diverse students whose families support them and want them to succeed. So I just thought I'd offer that as a challenge for all of us.
That's a really good point, Joe. I want to spend a few minutes on this regional aspect, Lauren and Russ. Russ, I was stuck with one of your foundation's comments about half of the students are coming from Inland Empire or San Joaquin Valley, et cetera, where the jobs are not, right? And so that's one observation. The second observation is that, and I'm part of, as is Adam, part of this Education Leaders Roundtable that your foundation is helping underwrite the conversations among all the segments of education in California. And one of the observations there is that both for the CSU and the UC, surprisingly for the UC, that students actually enroll regionally. You see the kids in Long Beach apply to Berkeley, and they get into Berkeley and UCLA, they go to UCLA, right? And so like 25% of everybody who goes off to college stays in the region. So when you think about, Lauren, the regional issues in the Inland Empire and the San Joaquin Valley, in contrast to, and I'm sorry, Lisa, but the North Coast, where we don't see that future demand, is the mismatch between where the jobs are and where the students are and where we want them to brain stay rather than brain drain. And then lay on top of that the politics of it all, that there's probably more political clout from the deep LA basin and the San Francisco Bay Area than there is perhaps from these more rural areas where the demand is higher. That is an interesting web, a quilt that's going to require smart people to think through how to navigate that. So ultimately, California doesn't become, you said two Californias, even a third California, but really unites back as one California. So Lauren, could you summarize again, just sort of at a high level, not necessarily with data, about this regionality, and I'd like Russ and others to comment about how that goes into our policy conversations with the board. What are the sort of lane lines we might want to have in those conversations?
So looking at, I know you don't want to go directly to the data, but just as an example, in Southern California region.
So which page is that on, so people can find it in their handout?
It's not on the handouts. I'm looking at.
Oh, this is, yeah. Turn off the webcam. This is stuff. This is proprietary stuff now.
But if you want to take a look at the slides that were presented to you, it's going to be related to slide number 4, growth in A through G completion will vary by region. So the Southern California region, we know, produces about 60% of all A through G eligible students. However, the 10 Southern California campuses account for only 54% of the students initially entering from a California public high school. And that when we look at the Bay Area high schools, where we produce 21% of eligible students, the 4 campuses in that region account for about the 17% of the students initially entering from a California public high school. But when you look at like the Central Valley, it's where the story is flipped, because Central Valley high schools currently produce about 9% of the A through G eligible students, and the 3 campuses in that region account for 10% of the students initially entering from a California public high school. Bottom line is that, you know, the traditional ways that we have handled the demand issue, and obviously trying to make sure that we have the economic means in order for us to be able to effectively prepare students, is that we've taken on more of an exclusive kind of approach as opposed to an inclusive approach. And what I mean by that, we raise the eligibility index, we declare impaction, and it's counterintuitive now in terms of what we have before us relative to the larger number of students that are certainly A through G ready, but also looking at the transfer students as well. And so the regional approach really takes, if you will, it requires us to really look at it where groups of campuses have to work together within a specific region in order for us to make determinations of how we're going to accommodate the growing number of students that are graduating, and as Tim just pointed out, they don't want to leave the region. And that more importantly, many of these students, certainly we know that in the Southern California region, we've already had some conversations with the LA campus as well as Dominguez Hills, that number of Latinx students, especially those that are coming from economically deprived backgrounds, they are the ones at our doors that how do we then say to them, we really appreciate, to any of these students, we really appreciate all the work that you have done to get prepared to enter, but we don't have room for you. And so it really is requiring us to have to think differently about I know that there's been some work already done by the Admissions Advisory Council for alternatives to impaction. But the reality is that we've got to move in that direction much quicker. And so from my humble estimation, it really does require having to sit with those campuses in those particular regions where we're not focusing in just on one campus, but really looking at a base of campuses and how we might be able to better accommodate the growing number of students that are before us who all deserve the opportunity for this CSU educational experience.
Russ, any thoughts on regionality?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult issue, but an opportunity. And Joe, I think, respond to what you were saying. I think while we need to tell our story as a CSU and a UC, we need to shape that story to fit your community. You need to tell the story for your community, because the story that you will tell, while it's consistent with the aggregate, there are needs for the LA Basin that are different and a different argument than is the argument for Fresno. And so it strikes me that as our best ambassadors, you as presidents and leaders in higher education can really help shape that story in your community. You know, we can talk about the aggregate data and the need, but you can sell that story within your region. And it's compelling. And you would think that would move the legislature to say, I've got to respond to these kids who are doing everything right in Fresno. I've got to respond. You know, the kids in Marin, God bless them. You know, I hope they do really well, but they've got more opportunities than some of the kids who are growing up in rural areas or in areas, inner city areas, where the jobs and challenges may not be easy to overcome. So to me, when I think regionality, I think it could be one thing that helps us, because we can help sell our story and move community leaders, political leaders, to understand the issue within their area and how we need to change. I think when you deal with it just on the broad, let's see if we can't get some of the money that's otherwise going to corrections or K-12 or health and welfare, those mega fights are tough. But you get into the region and fight that and explain what you're trying to get accomplished and why that your resources need to be adjusted to meet that demand, I think you've got a real shot.
Well, that's a strong voice of experience there. You know, you also mentioned, Russ, a little bit about administrative efficiencies, and I always like to make sure we also include the word effectiveness, because you can get efficient by just doing a poor job and comes back and then there's an audit. Larry. We are actively discussing regional administrative services. So when you have 3 or 4 campuses within a 20 or 30 mile radius, Chip Robertson's home for the coalition, I think there was like 7 campuses within 44 miles of Beverly Hills. I mean, can we do things different there? And there's groups thinking about that. But I'm also going to call on Fram Vergy on administrative stuff, in the sense that sometimes the administrative inefficiencies go beyond us, and some of the agencies we need to work with out of Sacramento, such as the fire marshal, and the kinds of stories that get told. And I'll ask Fram to do it carefully for the Fullerton story, but basically, you know, you do a major renovation and then fire marshal comes in and says, well, almost there, do this. You do that, and then they come back and say, well, I don't know why you did that, because this is really what you needed to do. And it's not only time, but real dollars, right, Fram? And I could pick on any of the 23.
So obviously, you just told the story, which is we have 2 instances on the campus where we've spent millions and millions of dollars and spent literally years trying to open up facilities. I'll start with our library. 5 years ago, our library suffered seismic damage in an earthquake, and 4 floors of our library closed. And we've been trying to open that library for the entire time, and it is not just a source, a sense of do we have the funds to fix the problem? We fixed the seismic issues, and now we actually have to renovate the innards of the library to get it open. And we've designated the funds for it. We're ready to start the work. And first, the fire marshal decided out of the blue that after we're a 60-year-old institution and that this 30-year-old building was all of a sudden a high-rise. And now that meant that we had to put in a whole new fire suppression system, and a whole new venting system. This is a building that has no windows in it, and a concrete building with no windows, and they said we have to put 78 windows into this building in order to open it. So then we say, okay, fine. We will do that, and we put together the plan to do that and take the plan to them, and they say, well, that's not good enough. There's a new set of rules. We comply with all those obligations, and we take it back to them, and they say that's not good enough. There's a new set of rules. We've been doing this for almost 3 years, trying to get the permits to begin the process of renovating the library, and we still today cannot get the permit to open the library. We have the money, we have the intestinal fortitude and the desire to open the library, but we can't get a fire marshal to approve our plan. No matter what plan, we go to them and we say, tell us exactly what you need, and they tell us exactly what they need. We go back and do it exactly, and they say, well, now that we've looked at that, I guess we weren't right. We need to do something different. Or I'll give you a completely different example. We have the old Western Law School building across the street from us that we call Fullerton Titan Hall now. We bought it. We put $30 million into it to make it seismically safe and renovate it. It's been sitting for 3 years waiting to open, again, because the fire marshal can't decide what the rules and regulations are going to be that will allow us to open this building. Up until about 9 months ago, we were told that we had to put, because we had done renovations and it had to come up to code, we had to put new stairwells on either side of the building to the tune of about $4.5 million. We discussed and discussed and discussed, and finally, disgusted, said, okay, fine, we'll put in the new stairwells on either side. And the fire marshal had to come out to approve the plans, to approve the stairwells. And a new fire marshal came out and said, oh, you don't need stairwells. We don't need them at all. There's no need for you to do that. So we said, great.
We have 78 windows. Can we use those? Put those in?
That's right. So we said, great. That means we can begin to occupy the building. Well, no, there's some new, now that I'm out here, there's some new rules and regulations that we'd like to look at for fire suppression and for life safety for your review. Again, long lists given, give them to the fire marshal, and then they turn around and change their rules over and over again. So I have 2 multi-million-dollar projects. I have 40,000 students on my campus and 1,900 seats in my library. I could double the size of my library. We're talking about a project that will take about 9 or 10 months to complete. And we have the money, the plans, and the resources, and we just can't get the fire marshal to approve it. I have a building across the street that that could house, a couple of hundred students in classes, and probably a couple of thousand students in classes every day that I can't even use, and it's been ready for use for 3 years, but we can't get the fire marshal to approve.
Thank you, Fram. So I think, Russ, one of the things that we're talking to the likely next administration on is administrative efficiencies that go beyond our walls, and asking for a directive and so we can, and it's not that we don't want to be accountable or safe, but there just has to be a more efficient and effective way to do this. So hang on to those 78 windows. We may need them on another campus, Fram.
Just to add on to that, and that's a tragic story to listen to that kind of process. If we're successful in getting a higher education bond, it'd be interesting to see what we could blend in there in terms of fast-tracking administrative approvals in order to meet student demand and graduation goals. And so I know it's amazing, but in Sacramento, when the Sacramento Kings were brought back, they were able to fast-track a lot of the approvals and move the construction of that facility in record time. So you just think about the corollary to that when you've got the pressing social need of reaching these students and meeting their demand. And isn't there a way to accommodate fair but responsive timelines to have facilities ready to go.
Well, thank you, Russ. And so I'm going to take the MC's prerogative and ask for final words from 4 people, starting with Lauren, Steve, Russ, and then Adam. Adam, you can have the podium. And when Adam's done, he's the last thing between us and lunch. And I ask that you, rather than sit with folks you always sit with, if you could spread out among the presidents and trustees and vice chancellors and follow up on the conversation. We have an hour set aside for lunch before we come back to our board meeting. But try and follow up on these and go from concept to what are some strategies and ideas that we should actually get serious about of the multitude, so we're not dueling with windmills here, but rather come at this with an eye to be successful. So Lauren, Steve, Russ, and Adam.
Thank you, Tim, and I'll be brief. The reality is that, from my perspective, that we continue to say that funding is of ultimate issue and concern for us as it relates to the access side, and of course it's also on the completion side. I do believe that, yes, that it's foundational. We've got to ensure that our message is very clear, that in order for us to meet California's goals, but also meet our own goals, that it really is important that we get the requisite funding in order to help us to do that. I think that it's also important that, just as we did on the completion side, we talked about a lot of different strategies that we could implement that didn't necessarily have a cost factor to it. And I know that we're hearing some of that now in terms of some of the comments that have been made, even in terms of how to best utilize your space, like on Fridays and Saturdays. And I know that some of you have done these space utilization studies, and you've now benefited more from being able to better understand where the gaps are, and you're able to fill in those gaps with more courses and course sections. There are ways that I think it would behoove us to really look very carefully outside of the funding model, not saying that that's not important, because it is, that there are some strategies that we likely could implement that could help us also on the access side, just as we have done on the success side. That's number one. Number two, what sticks with me is the comment about our story. And I believe that that is really important in terms of better understanding who we are as a CSU. But I believe that our mission really says a lot about who we are, and that we live our mission every single day. I think about, in particular, all the progress that we have made on the social mobility side, that, you know, the kind of effort and work that we have undertaken with populations of students, many of them whom, as we know, come from racially and economically challenged or different backgrounds, and that we take those individuals and we prepare them in such a way where we're fully confident that they are leaving us with the kind of knowledge and skills and dispositions that make them ready for either graduate or professional school, ready for the workforce, and that not only ready, but also that we're preparing them to be leaders in their communities and leaders in their fields. To me, that's a compelling story, and it really ties in and roots in who we are as the CSU. Now, I'm sure that we can build that story out even further, but I don't want us to lose the opportunity, as I always say, to smell the roses, that there is a story already of who we are as a CSU. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to build upon it.
I'm going to take off from what Lauren said, because in my mind there are kind of two sides of the story. One is the one that he just so well articulated, which is the human side and the results of the work that the CSU does. I would say just right alongside, which is another powerful message that we have to figure out creative ways of getting across, is there's a very blunt, hard-nosed, pro forma ROI type of story. And that simply is that we can pretty much chart that this is the one area that the state of California can invest in, where the dollars will come out the other end, and they'll come out more than what you put in. whether it's increased sales tax revenue, jobs where people are buying cars and houses, people who would now have jobs who otherwise wouldn't. It's clearly a very hard-nosed business case, I think, that we can make, that, in fact, if California needs to get to where it's going to be, to continue to be either the 5th largest, 4th, or 3rd largest economy in the world, there's only one pathway, and the pathway goes through the California State University. And it's that investment that is such a good investment. We've got the numbers. You saw it this morning. We can be very, very frugal and very, very efficient with a dollar, and in the end produce tomorrow's workforce, which is going to create the companies, which are going to have the workers in those companies, which will create new Apples and new Googles and other things. Look at today, Apple Computer, more than half of its employees are CSU employees. What's going to happen tomorrow? It's really up to the state to make that investment. And again, it's not giving us money. It's not spending money. It's investing in money that's going to come back to the state in multiple ways.
So I probably presented a few challenges that are out there, but I'm an optimist. I really am. I have confidence that California is going to solve this issue, among other things. California is a tremendous kind of enterprise, and you're a key part of it. And so I guess if you take anything from my comments, is have a realistic eye towards the future and start making the changes or decisions or framework that are going to sustain the university and access for students and providing quality education. You're too important to fail. So I hope I just laid the foundation for you to start considering some of the decisions you need to make for some of the challenges ahead. Thanks.
Too important to fail is perfect. Tim and I just talked about being too big to fail, but we are much more importantly too important. First and foremost, just some closing comments. I'd love to be the clock watcher and make sure that I'm running meetings on time, so I'm glad that we're on or ahead of schedule. So just for those of you out there, we've got plenty of time. I really want to thank Russ, as well as Steve and Lauren, of course, and your staffs who spent so much time putting these presentations together. Extremely helpful. It's a little bit nerve-wracking working with Tim and his staff developing this agenda. At first, it sounded to me like it was going to be rather dry and perhaps incoherent. And you did not disappoint. No, exactly the opposite. No, exactly the opposite. And I strive to represent my colleagues, and I hope I do so well. But I hope you found this as rewarding and educational and enjoyable. So thank you. What might be incoherent is that there is actually a thread between this presentation and our later portion of our meeting, which is equally important for the trustees. I want to especially thank the presidents for being here this morning. The roles you play are extremely important. We look forward to getting back with you tonight and toasting you. But the thread between this morning and this afternoon and what we'll be discussing as it relates to board leadership, trustee roles and responsibilities, the reports from the AGB, really in my mind anyway, this discussion tees up that discussion, which is really where this board as the systems policymakers needs to be and where we need to invest our time, our talent, and our treasure. And that is to not get into the weeds, but rather really focus on the big picture items where we can make the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, but make the biggest positive impact. And I think this discussion has teed us up well for that this afternoon. So with that as closing comments, we will break for lunch. We have an executive session, and then we will come back in public session around approximately 3:45 p.m. So everyone has an idea of where we are on timing. But with that, thank you, and enjoy your lunch.